The wind outside the station moved like a whisperless storm stirring the dry sand into clouds that never stopped dancing, but inside the research outpost everything was still and cold and quiet, where the lights hummed and the screens blinked without. Purpose and Lena sat alone by the control desk, watching the same empty sky through the same thick window that had shown her nothing new for 57 days. She had grown used to the silence of this place where no birds sang, no people passed by. And the only voice she heard anymore was her own, sometimes speaking into the recorder, sometimes just muttering into the metal air just to remember how her words used to sound when someone replied back. She missed Earth, but she didn't say it anymore because missing something too long made it disappear more. The planet below was lifeless, barren, dry, a dead rock spinning in space without memory. But the research station had been built to study its past, maybe its secrets, maybe the buried signs of civilizations lost under the dust. But none of that mattered now, not since Earth stopped sending messages, not since her last signal went unanswered one night while recording another log that probably no one would ever hear. She felt a tremble under her feet, a soft shiver that didn't match the rhythm of the station's hum. It lasted only a second, but it made her pause and glance up at the outer radar screen, and there it was, a shape descending through the sky, something small, fast glowing with a strange heat, and it was crashing, not landing, its trail burning orange against the night above the desert. And her heart jumped, not with fear, but with something she hadn't felt in weeks, something like purpose. She grabbed her jacket, moved through the steel corridor, stepped into the airlock, and opened the outer doors. The heat of the artificial sun above her barely reached through the endless wind, but she pushed forward, moving toward the crash site that her tracker was now mapping. Ahead of her steps she walked for minutes or maybe hours across the sands until she found it, a broken vessel embedded in the dirt, its metal bent, its surface scorched and melted. It looked like no ship she had ever seen, and she had studied plenty during her training, but this one was not human. It was not friendly either, not in appearance, not in shape. It looked like something made for silence and speed, and something in her chest said, "Turn back," but she didn't. She approached slowly, keeping her scanner-ready hands shaking a little, not from cold, but from the weight of what she might find. And when she reached the side of the broken craft, she heard it, a soft sound, not mechanical, not wind, not fire, but breath inside a narrow hatch that had popped open. She found him, or maybe it was in it, but to her it looked like a being, something tall, thin skin like metal and ash, glowing faintly with blue veins. And though his face was unlike anything she'd known, there were eyes deep and dark, and watching her, not blinking, not asking, just waiting. He was hurt, one arm twisted, his side torn. He could not move, and he did not speak. He did not beg, and he did not threaten, and still she hesitated, because everything in her training said leave. Now report this, run. But something older inside her, something human, told her, this is not how we leave the broken behind. She dragged him out slowly, gently wrapped him in her coat, though it barely fit, and walked back across the sands, one step at a time, the wind pulling at her legs, the weight heavy against her shoulder. But still she did not stop, because he was alive, and maybe that mattered more than any rule written in a manual. Back at the station she placed him on the med table and watched as the system tried to read his vitals, confused by the alien readings, but stabilizing them anyway. And through it all he watched, her eyes never closing, never blinking, just watching, as if trying to understand not the machines, but the hands that touched him, not with fear, but with something softer. She gave him water, though she did not know if he drank it. She spoke to him, though she knew he would not answer. She told him her name. She told him about the wind outside and the quiet inside, and about how she used to dream of stars that actually spoke back. And when she stopped talking, he nodded once, slow, not human, but somehow familiar. Days passed and he healed, or seemed to. He moved little, but his gaze followed her every time she entered the room, and she found herself speaking, more not to fill the silence, but to share things, pieces of a life he would never know, about parks and rivers, and food that made you close your eyes, and music that made you cry, and he listened to it all. With that stillness that made her feel like every word mattered, she began to wonder who he was, where he came from, why he was here. But she did not ask, not yet, because she felt the answer would come in time, and for now it was enough that he stayed. That he breathed, that he existed in her world, and did not destroy it. She called him Kale, not knowing his real name. Just something simple, easy. Something human, and he did not object. He responded with small movements, with slow learning gestures, copying. How she used her hands, how she tilted her head when she smiled, and once he even mimicked her laugh. Though it came out broken and strange and beautiful, in a way that stayed with her long after she left the room. She didn't know it yet, but something had already changed, something quiet and deep, something that would not be undone. And it was not about language or species or survival. It was about something older than that, something stronger, something that did not ask for permission before it took root. And though he was not made to feel, and though she had not planned to give her heart to anything that did not come from Earth, they had already started something that would not stop. Even the stars outside seemed to notice, blinking a little brighter, as if watching something rare unfold inside a station forgotten by time and history, but not by love. Days moved like slow rivers inside the station. Time no longer followed numbers or clocks, but instead followed footsteps and glances, and the soft sounds of breathing that echoed through the metal walls. Lena had stopped counting the mornings because every morning looked the same. The sky outside was a pale haze. The wind never rested, and the base lights never dimmed. They just kept humming like a memory too tired to fade. Kale was healing, that much she could see, though he still never spoke and never left the med chamber. He no longer looked like something broken. He now sat up on his own, leaned back against the smooth steel wall, and followed her with eyes that never once showed fear, just a quiet, steady kind of curiosity, as if he was watching not just her actions, but the reasons behind them. She continued talking to him every day, sometimes with purpose, sometimes with no plan at all, telling him about how the oceans on Earth used to taste like salt, and how the sky would turn orange during certain evenings, how children used to chase bubbles in city parks, and how people danced without rhythm just because they were happy. And he always listened, not blinking, not moving, just listening with that stillness that made her feel more heard than anyone ever had. She brought him objects from the storage room, little things she hoped might interest him, old tools. A compass, a dried flower pressed between clear sheets, a piece of broken mirror, and she would explain each item in simple words, holding them in her palm, while he watched with his tilted head and silent stare. And slowly he began reaching for them. Not to take them, just to feel their shape, like he was trying to understand the story trapped inside them. One evening when she played an old melody through the speaker, a tune from Earth's deep archives, slow and warm with soft voices humming like forgotten lullabies, Kale tilted his head toward the sound and made a small movement with his fingers, not quite in rhythm, but not random either, and it startled Lena in a way that made her breath catch, because it was the first time he had reacted to something beyond her presence, the first time he had shown interest in something created by a heart other than hers. That night she stayed longer, sitting near him, her back against the same wall, his shoulder almost close to hers, not touching, but not far either, and she told him how people used to fall in love over letters, how they waited for days just to hear the sound of someone's voice, how they used to believe in promises made under the moon. And Kale did not speak, but he turned toward her, and something in his eyes seemed to flicker like a thought, trying to become a feeling. The station remained quiet, but the systems were acting strange. Some doors took longer to respond, some screens blinked without reason, and the radar showed minor glitches like shadows passing through the edge of the atmosphere. Lena tried not to worry, but her instincts said something was out there, and she checked the communications logs again and again, even though no message had come from Earth in months. Just a blank screen with blinking silence. One afternoon, she noticed something on Kale's arm, under the skin, near the shoulder, a faint pulse, not from his veins, but from a deeper place, something mechanical, something hidden. She scanned him while he rested, and the readings confused the machine. a mix of organic and artificial energy, and when she checked the frequencies, she found a signal buried low, weak, almost dead, but still there, and it was transmitting something, not far, not loud, but constant. Her hands froze, and her heart tightened because now she understood why the system was glitching. Kale's body was still connected to something outside the base, something watching or waiting, and maybe even listening, and she looked at him with new eyes, no longer just as the quiet being who listened and learned, but as something sent here with purpose. She confronted him when he woke. His eyes opened without alarm, and he sat up slowly while she stood across the room holding the scanner close to her chest. She asked him why the signal was still active, why he had not told her what it meant, what it wanted, and he looked at her for a long time before reaching up slowly to touch the place on his arm where the pulse came from, pressed his fingers against the skin, closed his eyes, and the pulse stopped. The scanner went silent, and Lena watched the readings disappear one by one until there was nothing left but the quiet between them. She didn't understand how he had done it, but she understood what it meant. He had made a choice, not for data, not for duty, but for her. Voice shook when she asked him why, and this time he moved slowly, reaching out toward her, not to touch but to place his palm open in the space between them, a gesture that needed no words, a gesture that said everything. He could not speak, and in that moment, she understood he had not come to study weakness. He had come and found something stronger than any weapon. From that day onward, something shifted between them, not like lovers, not like friends, not like enemies, but like something new, something raw, and still forming, something built from silence and survival and eyes that no longer needed translation. She removed the broken transmitter from his body, with careful hands working late into the night, while he sat still and calm, and when it was done, she kept the device in a sealed container on her desk, not as evidence, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of the moment he stopped being a mission and became something real. After that they began working together, she showed him how the tools worked, how the base was built, how to process water and store solar energy, and he followed her through each step, mimicking her movement with near-perfect memory, but with his own rhythm, like he was learning how to build not just machines, but a life alongside her. She no longer recorded logs in the same way. Her voice changed, softer, steadier. She spoke not to the system, but to him, even when he was not in the room, and when he returned from small tasks. She gave him small smiles, like gifts not wrapped in paper, but in warmth. Something had started growing between them, something invisible but undeniable, and neither of them spoke of it, but both of them carried it like a new kind of gravity, and far beyond the clouds above them, something had noticed. Something had heard the silence breaking, and it was moving through space, not with hope, not with kindness, but with purpose. But for now, inside the station, there was peace, not because danger was gone, but because two beings from different worlds had found something worth holding onto, and neither of them was ready to let it go. The sun above the dead world never really rose, and never truly set. It just circled like a tired ghost, casting long shadows across the sand while the wind carried no scent and the sky held no birds, only stillness. But inside the station, life had started to pulse with something deeper than routine, something heavier than science, something that moved between two beings who had never meant to meet. Lena woke early, now not because alarms told her to, but because she wanted to see if Kale was still there, wanted to hear the quiet of his movement through the hallway, wanted to share another wordless moment over tasks that no longer felt meaningless. And Kale was always awake before her, always in the control room, or by the power core, or simply standing near the glass, watching the horizon as if listening to the past. They had started moving together in rhythm, not rehearsed, but natural. She would reach for a tool, and he would already have it in hand. She would point to a panel, and he would already be beside it, fixing what she had only thought of. And somewhere in those silent days, Kale had become something more than a guest, more than a visitor, more than anything she could name. But that peace was not built to last. It began with a signal so faint it barely registered a soft flicker in the corner of her screen. At first Lena thought it was static, or another ghost reading from the storm. But then it repeated a low-frequency wave too perfect to be random, and it was getting closer. She ran diagnostics, checked the antenna, realigned the satellite feed, and when she decoded the pulsar, breath caught in her chest because it was not from Earth, and it was not from any system they were meant to monitor. It was from space, and it was not human. She turned to Kale, and for the first time in weeks, she saw a reaction before she even said a word. His posture changed, not defensive, but aware. Like he had already guessed what was coming, and he walked toward the panel before she could speak, pressing his fingers against the monitor and scanning the signal without a word. It was a message from his kind, and it was not asking. It was commanding. It told him to return. It told him to complete the task. It told him that deviation would not be tolerated, and it mentioned the base it mentioned. Her Lena stood frozen as Kale read the lines flashing across the screen, symbols she could not understand, but meanings she could feel in her skin, and Kale did not move. He just stared at the message until it stopped blinking, and the silence returned heavier than before. She asked him what it meant, and this time he answered not with voice, but with hands, opening slowly, showing her the scar on his arm where the transmitter once lived, showing her the place where purpose once rested, and then lowering his hands to his side in quiet surrender. But Lena needed more than gestures. She needed truth, so she asked again, louder this time, her voice carrying something raw, not anger, but fear. And he turned toward her, stepped close, and raised one hand to the side of her head, his fingers hovering near her temple, asking for permission, and she nodded once. Just once, and that was enough. In that moment, she felt it, a flood of memory, not hers, but his images, without sound, emotions without names. His world built of metal skies and cold suns, cities without laughter, families without touch, warriors without joy. She saw how he was made, how his kind erased weakness, how they punished empathy, how they feared anything that could not be controlled, and she saw how he was chosen to observe, not to learn, but to judge, not to connect, but to report. She saw how he arrived and how everything changed when he met her, how her voice became the first sound that didn't cause him pain, how her stories became his compass, how her hands became something he wanted to follow, not because he was ordered, but because he hoped. She pulled back, gasping, as the connection broke, and she looked at him no longer as a stranger, but as someone who had carried pain for longer than she could measure, and had chosen to let it go for something he barely understood, and still wanted. Kale stood still, waiting for judgment, but Lena did not speak right away. She turned back to the screen, stared at the message still frozen on the last line, and she made a choice. She opened the old transmission line, one not meant to reach Earth but capable of reaching anyone nearby, and she began to broadcast. She did not send data. She did not send fear. She sent a message of peace. She spoke in slow, clear words, describing what had happened, what had changed, who Kale had become, and what he had chosen, and she sent it again and again, every hour on repeat. Kale watched her with a look that could not be translated, but it said everything. And then he stepped forward, placed his hand over hers on the console, and nodded once, not to approve, but to share the weight of the moment. Later that night, she found him standing outside the hatch under the artificial dome, looking at the stars that barely twinkled, and she walked beside him, not asking what he was thinking, just standing still, letting the quiet wrap around them like a shield. They knew something would come soon, maybe a ship, maybe a warning, maybe something worse, but for now they had this small piece of stillness carved between two storms, and they held on to it, without words, without questions, because some things do not need to be said to be real. In the days that followed, they prepared not for battle, but for understanding. They built a new signal tower, stronger, clearer, wider. Kale designed parts. Lena installed them. They moved like builders, not fighters, like artists, not soldiers, and in every step they shared something no order could erase. And in the sky far beyond their reach, something stirred, something listened, something that did not understand what love was, but would soon learn that not even silence can stop it once it begins. The air inside the station felt heavier, not with heat, not with pressure, but with the quiet weight of what was coming, something unspoken, something waiting just beyond the edge of vision where the sky curved and the stars refused to blink. Cale stood by the outer wall, his gaze fixed beyond the horizon where nothing moved. But he knew something was near, and Lena could feel it too, not in the systems or the scanners, but in her chest, in the way her heartbeat no longer followed its old rhythm, and how her hands trembled even when holding nothing. They had stopped speaking because words no longer helped. They simply moved through the station like shadows in sync, checking the relay panels, tightening the outer shields, rerouting power to the tower. Cale's hands worked with calm precision while Lena's mind ran ahead, always searching for outcomes that ended without loss, but every path she imagined ended with sacrifice, and she hated that she had finally found something worth protecting only to fear it would be taken. Cale had changed in ways no machine could measure. He moved not just with function but with purpose, not just with orders but with thought. He had learned the value of silence, and then the power of presence. He had learned to wait without demand, to listen without suspicion, to stand beside without needing to lead. And Lena had changed too. She no longer thought of him as alien. She no longer wondered what he was or why he came, because she knew now that he had been meant to break her world, but somehow had chosen to help rebuild it instead. Evening, the sky cracked open, not with fire, but with a single silent light descending slowly like judgment wrapped in silver metal. The ship came, not fast, not loud, just certain and final. And Lena watched from the roof of the tower, her hands clenched by her sides, while Cale stood beside her, not hiding, not afraid, just steady. She could feel his breath even through the still air. And when he turned his head slightly, she knew he was not looking for escape. He was waiting for her. Ship landed without wind, without sound, without dust. Just a smooth presence settling onto the cracked desert, as if it had always belonged. And the ramp opened without hesitation, releasing not soldiers, but forms built like Cale, tall and silent, with eyes that held no warmth and movements that did not seek permission. And they approached the tower with perfect symmetry, not rushing, not waiting. Lena stepped forward before Cale could, and her voice broke the air like a stone in still water. She told them he would not return. She told them he had changed, that he had learned something they had forgotten long ago, something called mercy, something called choice, something called love. And they did not reply. They simply looked past her, and one of them raised a small device that blinked once, and Cale stepped forward, not to run, not to fight, but to shield her. He walked until he stood between her and the others, his back straight, his hands open, his voice unused but not empty. And he raised one hand slowly, not in defense, but in message, and the lights on their suits flickered, uncertain, because they had not been trained for this. They had not prepared for one of their own to refuse. The leader stepped forward, and for the first time spoke a language without sound, words carried on, thought, direct and sharp. And he asked Cale if he had chosen corruption, if he had allowed himself to be infected by weakness. And Cale replied, not with denial, but with stillness, and then turned his head toward Lena, only for a moment, and in that moment everything changed. He stepped closer to her gently, and she reached out without thinking, her fingers brushing his wrist, and the gesture was not grand, not loud, but it echoed in the minds of those watching. And the leader raised the device again, and this time it pulsed, not with sound, but with force, a beam of light, sharp and fast, meant to erase, not harm, meant to reset, not kill. But Cale moved faster, his body blocking the path, his arm shielding her form, and the light struck him directly without mercy. Lena screamed, but no sound came from her throat, only the shaking of her hands as she caught him falling, his weight pressing against her knees, his breath shallow and fading, and his eyes still open, still watching her, like he had no regrets, only peace. She held his face, whispering his name again and again, but his body was already dimming like a fire with no fuel. The others stood still, watching, unmoving, unblinking, and then slowly, one by one, they turned without a word, without confirmation, and returned to their ship, their silence louder than any battle, their departure more final than any war, and the ramp closed with no echo, and the ship rose into the sky like a ghost released from duty. Lena knelt there long after they had gone, her arms wrapped around Cale's body, her tears falling into the dust, and her voice finally returning soft and cracked, and she told him he was not weak, he was not broken. He was not lost, he was love, and that was more than they could ever understand, and she held him close, as the light in his eyes dimmed into darkness. But when she woke the next morning, she found no body, only the imprint of him in the sand, as if the stars had come and taken him back, not as a prisoner, but as something holy, and she stood there, under the cold sky with the wind in her hair, and a pulse in her chest that would never forget. And when she returned to the tower, she saw the signal light blinking on the console, not a warning, not a threat, just a soft repeating pattern that she recognized as his, and she placed her hand over it, eyes closed, heart open, and whispered his name one last time, not as a goodbye, but as a promise. The station no longer felt like a machine. It breathed in the silence left behind it, moved with a rhythm, shaped not by wires and circuits, but by memory and meaning, and Lena walked its halls like someone walking through a dream, still clinging to the voice of something gone, but not truly lost. Every step echoed softer, every light flickered warmer, every space he had once touched now held a kind of quiet that refused to fade. Outside, the sky stayed the same, dry wind dragging dust in circles above a world that never changed, but Lena had changed. And nothing around her could return to what it was before, because something inside her refused to forget. She still heard him in the silence, still saw him in reflections, still felt the warmth of his presence in the places where he once stood. And even though his voice had never formed words in her language, she remembered every message he had spoken through his eyes and his silence and his choices. She had not told Earth what happened when communication finally returned. She gave them only fragments, just enough to explain the damage to the station, the interference in the systems, the signal that broke through and then vanished. She left out the rest, because some truths were not made for reports. Some stories did not belong in files, and Cale was not a line in a transmission. He was a living moment in time, and she would keep that moment hers. Blinking light never stopped it, pulsed at night, a soft steady glow on the console near the window, and she never touched it, never decoded it, never shut it off, because she believed it was him. She believed something of him remained in that light, a signal from beyond, or perhaps from something deeper. And whenever she sat beside it, she found peace, not because she understood it, but because it stayed. She began to change the station little by little, not with plans or orders, but with feeling. She painted the inner walls with soft colors taken from old earth palettes, skies at dusk, oceans at dawn, fields before harvest, and added warmth. Where once there was only metal, she planted seeds in the soil chamber, vegetables, herbs, even wildflowers, and watched them bloom slowly against the artificial light, as if they too refused to die. She spoke less now, but not because she was empty. She had filled herself with something quieter, something stronger, something that needed no sound. And when she spoke to the plants, to the wind, to herself, she sometimes imagined he listened, not from above, not from far, but from within, as if her voice had found a way to carry across whatever distance separated them. She found the small object he had carved from spare alloy hidden beneath one of the panels. It was shaped like the earth, not perfect, not smooth, but shaped by hand, with care, with memory, with something close to love. And she kept it beside her bed, holding it when sleep came hard, when the nights grew long and the wind outside howled too loud. She wrote in the logs again, but only for herself, short entries filled with moments, not missions. She wrote about how he had paused when she smiled, how his fingers brushed her shoulder one evening without reason, how he had chosen her without being told, and how she had learned to see him not as other, but as something known, something familiar, something hers. One morning she stood at the highest point of the station, where the dome opened just enough to let her feel the raw air, and she raised her face to the sky. watching the stars fade slowly into the light, and she whispered the same words she said every morning since he had gone. Not goodbye, not come back, just thank you. And she knew somewhere something had heard her time move differently. Now it no longer counted in hours or days, but in growth and change, in the slow return of hope. And Lena knew the world beyond still held danger, still carried war and silence and distance. But here in this small, forgotten station, something had bloomed where no one expected it, and she would never let it die. She built a small memorial near the far wall. Not with stone, not with names, but with pieces of what he left behind: a burnt panel, a broken transmitter, a strand of cloth from her old jacket folded carefully, and the carved earth at the center. And she sat before it every evening, sometimes with tears, sometimes with laughter, always with truth. And she spoke to it not for comfort, but for connection. The story was not told to others, not because it lacked meaning, but because it belonged to her and to him, and no one else could carry it the way she did. And she believed that was enough. Somewhere in the stars, beyond the reach of her machines, beyond the grasp of her understanding, something moved, not with orders, not with cold purpose, but with memory, and maybe even with feeling. And she liked to believe he had not been erased, not forgotten, not lost. Maybe he had returned to his kind, not to be punished, but to teach. Maybe the silence they carried had cracked just enough to let a little light in. Maybe love had left a scar they could not erase, and maybe that was the beginning of something far bigger than both of them. But Lena did not need to know for sure, because she had already lived it. She had already seen it. She had already given and received. It had come from a world without touch, and she had given him warmth. He had come from a race without feeling, and she had given him love. He had come with orders and left with freedom. No alien deserved that kind of love, and yet he gave it to her anyway, without asking, without knowing, without ever needing to speak it. And she carried it now, not as a wound, but as a light, one that never flickered, one that never needed fuel, one that would never be taken. And somewhere in the stars, a signal blinked slow and steady, like a heartbeat that had learned how to feel the end.